We're now going to talk about burnout and casting. The essential question is, why are the safety procedures and steps of the burnout process so important for the casting process? You can also see that you can take some Cornell notes, which are linked in the bottom of this slide. The learning targets for the burnout process are: I understand the tools, techniques, and order of the burnout process in order to prepare the metal needed as well as participate in casting. I understand all safety protocols to protect my body and others during the burnout process. And I understand the timeline and my personal responsibilities to cast my piece. This is just a reminder that before you invest your model and think that you're ready for the burnout process and actual casting, you need to make sure that you have weighed your model appropriately, that you've attached sprues, and that you've invested it correctly as well. The burnout process is basically where you're going to take your flask and put it inside a kiln that is quite hot. It actually gets up to 1200 degrees. You can see that it's glowing a little bit orange there. They've opened the red hot kiln, and you can see the flasks inside the kiln. Remember that you're going to be waiting 2 days before you can put your flask with the investment in it in the kiln. Again, it's not wise to reheat the flask, so it's really important that you are present the day that you cast. If you are not going to be present for whatever reason, you need to make sure that you contact your instructor because the cast may fail if it's fired multiple times. During the burnout process, we're basically going to take the flask and put it on a wire grate, and all of the wax is going to melt out the bottom. The burnout process actually takes 8 to 10 hours totally, so we will actually be starting the digital kiln during the evening so that it's ready to cast when you get to class. Some of the things that you need to be aware of are the PPE, or the personal protective equipment that's needed for casting. As you can see, there's a face shield, there are fire retardant gloves, and there's a fire retardant apron you also need to use during this process. That is in addition to tying your hair back. We also have to wear welding glasses to protect our eyes from the flame that will be used during the casting process. As you can see here, there is a bunch of scrap silver that we will be cutting up and using to do the casting process. We also sometimes use something called silver shot, but when we do not have that, the recycled pieces will work just as well for casting. Here you can actually see the pieces of metal have to be completely clean before you cast them. They also need to be cut into dime-sized pieces in order to melt quickly so that your cast actually works. There's about a 10-minute window from when the flask comes out of the kiln and has to be completely finished with the casting process. So it's important to be able to melt the pieces of silver quickly, and dime-sized pieces work really well for that. Here you can see the arm and spring that's inside the centrifuge box that's on the table in the back. There's a lever attached to a spring with a pin where you can see the arrow on that diagram. Basically, there's a weight on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you can see the crucible. That's that funny-looking sled thing there. That's going to be filled with metal. That's where we're going to melt the metal. And then your flask will go on the very right-hand side where it sort of looks like there's like a T there. It will hold the flask while we're heating your metal. You actually have to wind that arm 3 times before you pull the pin to hold it in place, because the spring whips the arm around really fast when the metal is molten, and it shoves the molten metal in the hole where your model was in order to create your casting. So during the casting process, you need to remember to add about half of your metal in the crucible before the instructor starts heating the piece. And actually what we normally do is we put half of that metal in before we even bring the flask out at all, in order to make sure that we have all of the 10 minutes to get the process done. So having half of the metal in the crucible actually is the perfect amount to start heating and get it molten, and then we add little bits to the end until all of the metal is molten. It works the best that way. Here you can actually see the person heating the metal and putting the flask in. We always in class put the flask in first, and you can see the tongs holding the flask, and the space right here is actually where the flask would go. and then we would actually be heating it like what you're seeing in this picture. But I actually don't heat the arm until after the flask is placed in the arm. It's safer that way. There are several different instructor versus student roles for what is done during the casting process. Basically, you need to know as a student, you need to make sure that you're wearing your PPE, you need to have your metal ready. You're going to be adding the borax, which is the granules that clean the metal before it's cast. You're also going to be holding the top of the centrifuge cover, and then you'll be putting that on when we release the arm that spins the metal around. You'll also be putting your piece in the bucket of water, which quenches the piece and actually shatters the investment. The last thing you're going to do is you're actually going to be removing any of the rest of the investment from your cast piece. You will pickle it, and then you will remove the sprues and button from your piece with probably a jeweler's saw. And then you'll be responsible for cleaning up the piece at the end by completing the finishing process. So, one other thing we have to talk about is there's a gas tank in the back of the room. It is an acetylene tank, and what you need to be aware of is that you have to be very, very careful with that acetylene tank. If you knock that tank over and it shears off the top part of the tank can seriously go through a brick wall, which could potentially kill someone. So it's very important to be very careful around the gas tank. Again, the instructor will be placing the flask in the centrifuge arm, so you do not need to worry about that. Once the flask is removed from the kiln, it will actually be placed in the centrifuge arm, and the metal will be heated in the crucible. Then the pin that holds the arm will be removed, and the arm will spin very quickly in order to shoot the molten metal into the space where your mold was. After about a minute of spinning, the centrifuge top can be removed, and with a gloved hand, the instructor will stop the spinning and remove the flask. The instructor will then use the tongs to remove the flask from the centrifuge and will immerse it in the bucket of water, which will quench the piece, breaking the investment in order to release the now silver ring that you've created. Sometimes, if you did not do this process correctly, there is something called blowout that happens. What that means is that the metal bursts through either the top or the sides of the flask because you did something incorrectly during the investment process. Either your piece didn't have enough investment powder in it, you didn't wait the appropriate amount of time, or you put your piece too close to either the edges or the top of the flask, which again creates problems when we cast. That's why we warned you about this to begin with. This is what blowout actually looks like. So when your metal is molten inside the crucible, it would shoot into the flask, but then because it breaks open in the back, there's all this metal that goes all over the inside of the centrifuge. All those little pieces of metal that are on the inside of the centrifuge area are there because of problems that happened with different castings. Here you can actually see the button that is on the bottom of your piece. So on these examples, the ring is on the top, the sprues are in the middle, and the button is on the bottom. This is what your piece should look like if it casted correctly. The button may not be that big, it might be smaller, and that's okay. It's just it definitely should have a button when you are done. Here's an example of somebody quenching a piece once it has been cast in a bucket of water. The bucket of water should be right next to the centrifuge when we are doing this process. Remember, as you are removing your piece from the bucket, even if the water's a little bit warm, the metal should be completely cool in about 30 seconds. So it's okay to reach your hands in and find your piece. Additionally, you have to make sure that you take a toothbrush and remove any additional investment from your model, and then you're going to pickle it before you remove the sprues and the button in order to start the finishing process. Here you can see someone is trying to cut the sprues off with a green cutters. You can try that, but that is much more difficult than taking a jeweler's saw and cutting the sprue off that way. It seems like more work, but it's actually easier to do, and it doesn't hurt your hands. Here you can see the button and sprues before they were pickled and after they were pickled on the right. As you're pickling, remember your safety protocols to be wearing gloves, safety glasses, and using the copper tongs. So here you can actually see the gas tank, which will be next to the centrifuge area. You can see the fire retardant gloves and apron, and then the face shields are normally underneath the table where the centrifuge is. The kiln is very close to where the centrifuge area is. Just a reminder, once you are done quenching your piece, you do need to start the finishing process, and this actually shows you that you should be filing, sanding, and then buffing, taking photos for your digital portfolio, and then you're going to finish the reflections. And just remember, one of the other things that you might actually need to do before filing is you might actually need to grind parts of the silver off of your piece depending on how much of the sprue you could or couldn't get off as you were cutting the sprue and button off of your piece. You should now be able to summarize the essential question from the beginning.